Picture this, it's October 1347. The harvest is done, but your grain stores are half what they need to be. Winter is coming, and you know that before spring returns, someone in your village won't make it. This isn't Game of Thrones, this was reality for millions of people across medieval Europe. Today, we're going to cover the brutal truth of medieval winter survival. How did ordinary people endure months of darkness, cold, and hunger with technology that wouldn't keep a modern camping trip comfortable? The answer reveals both the darkest and most inspiring aspects of human resilience. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that discussing historical hardship and mortality requires sensitivity. The struggles we'll explore represent real human suffering across centuries. We approach this topic with respect for those who lived these experiences, focusing on historical facts and the remarkable strength of the human spirit. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy stories like this, consider liking and subscribing. Now, back to the story. Let's start with autumn, when survival wasn't just hoped for, it was fought for. September meant everything. Medieval peasants faced what historians call the harvest gamble, a brutal race against time, where failure meant death. Unlike modern farmers with weather forecasts and crop insurance, medieval villagers watched the sky with the desperation of people whose lives hung in the balance. The mathematics was unforgiving. Historical sources reveal that medieval families needed roughly 72 to 86 bushels of grain per household annually, that's 12 to 17 bushels per person just to survive. Bad weather, disease, or pests could cut yields by 70%. Yet landlords still demanded their taxes, typically 1/3 of whatever you grew, regardless of how little that was. Here's where it gets truly desperate. Peasants faced what medieval records call the counting. After the harvest, families would count grain by grain, calculating daily rations for the next 6 months. Too generous in autumn meant starvation in February. Too conservative meant watching children cry from hunger while grain rotted in storage. Archaeological evidence from sites like Warren Percy reveals the physical toll. Over 600 skeletal remains recovered from this medieval village show the harsh realities of rural life, malnutrition patterns, disease markers, and death rates that paint a stark picture of survival against impossible odds. The harvest itself was a community battle. Entire villages worked from dawn to dusk, racing against weather that could destroy months of work in hours. Medieval weather patterns were more unpredictable than today's climate. The Little Ice Age was beginning, bringing killing frosts that arrived without warning. Women worked alongside men, children as young as 5 gathered grain, and the elderly sorted wheat from chaff despite arthritic hands. Because here's the thing about medieval harvest time, there was no retirement, no sick leave, no calling in help. Every hand worked, or people died. While grain-filled bellies would save lives. But here's the deadly catch, most forests belonged to lords, who guarded them jealously. The forest laws of medieval England were ruthless. Peasants couldn't cut down trees, and had to gather only fallen branches, broken limbs, and whatever they could reach without climbing. Legal wood collection happened through carefully regulated systems. Peasants could gather by hook or by crook, using hooked staffs to pull down dead branches, but only what they could reach. Living trees were forbidden. Even fallen branches had to be collected on specific days, creating desperate competitions, where villages fought over scraps. The logistics were staggering. Wood had to be cut, split, dried, and stored before winter moisture ruined it. Wet wood burned poorly, and created dangerous levels of smoke. Families spent entire autumn days hauling loads that would barely last a week. Women and children became experts at finding alternative fuels. Dried cow dung, peat, even old thatch from roofs, everything combustible was collected. Medieval account books reveal families trading precious food for fuel because warmth was more valuable than full bellies. Starting a fire wasn't flicking a switch. Most homes lacked chimneys until the 12th century. Smoke-filled single rooms created a choking haze that medieval people simply accepted as normal. Eye problems and respiratory diseases were epidemic. The fire itself required constant attention. Letting it die meant potentially deadly consequences. Rekindling required precious resources, like tinder fungus or flint, which many couldn't afford to replace. Some families assigned rotating watch duties, ensuring someone always tended the flames. Here's something that reveals medieval desperation: fire theft. Neighbors would steal burning embers from each other's hearths. Court records from medieval England document cases where families were prosecuted for taking fire from their neighbors. Imagine being so poor that you'd risk legal punishment to steal something as basic as flame. The technical challenge was enormous. Fire starting required dry tinder, usually made from cloth scraps or specially prepared fungus. The process involved striking flint against steel to create sparks, then carefully nursing tiny flames into a sustainable fire. In damp conditions, this could take hours, time that families didn't have. Archaeological excavations reveal hearths worn smooth by generations of use, surrounded by ash deposits several feet deep. These weren't just cooking areas, they were the difference between survival and freezing to death. But fire brought its dangers. House fires were catastrophic. Wooden structures with thatched roofs could burn completely in minutes. Entire villages occasionally burned down from a single uncontrolled hearth. Yet, the risk of fire was less terrifying than the certainty of freezing without it. With fuel secured, medieval families turned inward, transforming their bodies and homes into fortresses against the cold. Medieval winter clothing wasn't about fashion, it was armor against death. The wealthy wore linen, wool, and fur, but peasants made do with whatever they could weave, repair, or inherit. The layering system was ingenious. Starting with a linen undertunic, then wool tunics, followed by cloaks, and finally, whatever additional garments the family owned. Children wore adult clothes cinched with robe. Nothing was wasted, even threadbare garments became inner layers. But here's what medieval clothing inventories reveal: families owned an average of just 3 complete outfits per person. Winter meant wearing everything simultaneously. Imagine putting on every piece of clothing you own, then adding borrowed items from family members. That was a normal winter dress for 6 months. The textile production was back-breaking labor. Women spent entire days spinning wool into thread. A single shirt required roughly 40 hours of spinning work. Weaving fabric took another 20 hours. Then cutting, sewing, and finishing added more time. A basic winter cloak represented weeks of constant labor, making each garment precious beyond modern comprehension. Medieval families developed sophisticated clothing strategies that modern survival experts still study. Body heat was captured through tight-fitting inner layers, then insulated with loose outer garments. Wool was preferred because it retained warmth even when wet, crucial in homes where dampness was constant. Here's something that reveals medieval desperation: clothing inheritance was deadly serious. Wills from medieval England detail bitter family fights over single garments. A good wool cloak could mean survival for one person and death for another. The extremities posed special survival challenges. Mittens were luxury items. Most people wrapped their hands in cloth strips that froze solid in extreme cold. Feet were covered with wool socks inside leather shoes, stuffed with straw for insulation. Preservation methods seem primitive now, but they represented centuries of accumulated wisdom. Salt curing, smoking, and drying transformed perishable harvests into winter lifelines. Root cellars, dug deep into the earth, maintained consistent temperatures that kept vegetables from freezing or rotting. But even perfectly preserved food faced enemies. Rats, mice, and insects could destroy months of work in days. Medieval granaries used raised platforms and smooth-walled containers, but losses of 20 to 30% were considered acceptable and planned for in family food calculations. The preservation techniques were sophisticated engineering. Meat was salted in precise ratios. Too little salt meant deadly spoilage. Too much meant inedible food that could poison the family. Smoking required specific wood types: oak for beef, apple for pork, and hickory for fish. The process took weeks, with families maintaining constant fires to create preserving smoke. Medieval families developed complex food management systems that distributed both responsibility and risk. Women typically managed grain supplies, men controlled preserved meats, and children were responsible for gathering stored vegetables. This distribution prevented any single person from making catastrophic mistakes that could doom the entire family. The preservation process required enormous amounts of salt, which was extremely expensive. A single pound of salt cost what a worker earned in 3 days. Poor families used alternative methods, burying vegetables in sand, storing apples in straw, and keeping root vegetables in underground pits. Food testing became a survival skill passed down through generations. Medieval families could identify spoiled grain by smell, recognize dangerous mold patterns, and detect meat that was beginning to turn. Children learned these skills as early as age 5, because a single mistake in food evaluation could kill the entire family. Medieval peasant homes were marvels of efficient misery. Single rooms, typically 12 by 16 feet, housed entire families plus essential livestock. Dirt floors, thatched roofs, and walls of wood and clay provided minimal insulation against temperatures that regularly dropped below freezing. The central hearth dominated everything. Families arranged their lives around this circle of warmth, sleeping in concentric rings based on age and vulnerability. Infants slept closest to the fire, elders next, then healthy adults at the periphery, where temperatures could be 20 degrees colder. But here's what archaeological evidence reveals about medieval homes: they were engineered for heat retention with sophisticated techniques. Thick walls, small windows, and low ceilings trapped warm air. The dirt floors were advanced technology, mixed with straw and animal dung, then packed hard. They provided insulation and could be easily repaired when damaged. The construction materials tell fascinating stories of medieval engineering. Wattle and daub walls, interwoven branches covered with clay, created surprisingly effective insulation. Thatched roofs, sometimes 3 feet thick, provided excellent thermal protection. These weren't primitive structures, they were carefully designed survival shelters. Privacy didn't exist. Families shared body heat, breath, and intimate space for months. The psychological pressure was immense, yet somehow most endured. Modern experiments in confined living rarely last weeks. Medieval families managed entire seasons while maintaining family bonds and social structures. The animals shared human living space for practical reasons that modern science validates. Cows, pigs, and chickens provided significant body heat, their metabolisms warming the entire structure. But this created other challenges: disease transmission, sanitation problems, and the constant smell of animal waste mixed with human habitation. Artificial light was a luxury beyond most people's reach. Candles cost more than daily wages. Rushlights, reeds dipped in fat, provided flickering illumination for perhaps an hour. Most families lived by firelight alone, creating a rhythm of life. Sunset meant activity stopped. Work, travel, and social life compressed into daylight hours. Winter days lasted barely 8 hours, creating a prison of darkness. Families had to accomplish everything necessary for survival in this brief window of natural light. The wealthy displayed power through light itself. Castles blazed with hundreds of candles, visible for miles. This wasn't just comfort, it was a statement of dominance over nature itself. The ability to create light after dark represented wealth, power, and control over the fundamental forces that governed medieval life. But here's what medieval time records reveal: families developed sophisticated schedules around available light. Dawn meant immediate work, no gradual awakening or morning routines. Dusk meant instant transition to firelight activities. The rhythm of medieval life was dictated by the sun with absolute precision. The darkness created its own social dynamics and survival strategies. Families gathered around hearths for warmth, but also for safety. Medieval people believed night brought supernatural dangers, wolves, bandits, and evil spirits. The fire wasn't just light, it was protection against both real and imagined threats that stalked the winter darkness. Medieval medicine combined rational observation with desperate superstition. Herbal remedies like willow bark, containing natural aspirin, actually worked. But bloodletting, trepanation, and prayers to saints were equally trusted. Winter diseases were ruthless. Respiratory infections, dysentery, and scurvy killed regularly. Families expected death during cold months. The question wasn't if, but who. Child mortality reached 50% in harsh winters, a statistic that archaeological evidence from sites like Warren Percy confirms through skeletal analysis. Yet medieval people weren't passive victims. They developed a sophisticated understanding of symptoms, quarantine procedures, and herbal treatments. Many remedies modern science has validated: garlic for infections, honey for wounds, and certain herbs for fever. The psychological impact of constant death was devastating. Parents learned not to become too attached to infants. Children grew up expecting siblings to die. Communities developed elaborate rituals around death, not just for religious reasons, but as coping mechanisms for trauma. Medieval winters weren't hibernation, they were seasons of different work. Women spun thread, wove cloth, and mended everything the family owned. Men carved tools, repaired equipment, and crafted items for the spring trade. Children learned essential skills through constant observation and practice. Storytelling wasn't entertainment, it was cultural survival. Oral traditions passed down practical knowledge, moral lessons, and collective memory. These weren't just stories, they were the compressed wisdom of generations, containing survival information disguised as entertainment. Time moved differently. Without clocks, seasons, or artificial schedules, winter days blurred together. People measured time by meals, prayers, and the gradual lengthening of days after the winter solstice. The psychological challenge of enduring months of sameness required mental discipline. Indoor games developed around available materials. Dice made from bone, simple board games scratched into wood, riddles, and word games that required no equipment. These activities weren't frivolous, they were essential for maintaining mental health during months of confinement. The most remarkable aspect of medieval winter survival wasn't technological, it was psychological. Communities bound together by shared hardship developed resilience. Neighbors shared food when others faced starvation, knowing they might need similar help tomorrow. Religious faith provided a framework for accepting suffering while maintaining hope. Small joys, a successful hunt, a child's laughter, a clear starry night, became treasured memories that sustained people through the darkest months. Love wasn't romantic luxury, it was a survival strategy. Families who supported each other emotionally had better survival rates. Couples who maintained intimacy despite cramped conditions often outlived those who became isolated. The social bonds weren't just pleasant, they were life-saving. medieval communities developed sophisticated support systems. Widows and orphans were absorbed into extended family networks. Skilled craftsmen shared knowledge freely, understanding that community survival depended on collective expertise. Even in the depths of winter, people maintained connections that prevented the social isolation that could be as deadly as cold or hunger. When spring finally arrived, it wasn't just a seasonal change, it was resurrection. Medieval people who survived winter had accomplished something genuinely heroic. They had stared death in the face for months and refused to surrender. The first signs of spring triggered community celebrations. The lengthening days, the first green shoots, the return of birds, these weren't just pleasant changes, they were proof that the community had successfully cheated death once again. Spring cleaning wasn't about tidiness, it was about purging the accumulated filth, disease, and death of winter. Homes were scrubbed, clothing was aired, and the sick were moved outdoors to recover in fresh air. The entire community participated in this ritual of renewal and rebirth. Modern comfort makes it easy to forget this truth. Every medieval person who lived to see multiple springs was, by definition, a survivor of extraordinary hardship. Their genes, their stories, their accumulated wisdom, all of it was tested by winter and found worthy. Understanding medieval winter survival helps us appreciate both the challenges our ancestors faced and the remarkable ingenuity humans have always possessed. These historical experiences remind us that human adaptability and mutual support have been constants throughout history. While we face different challenges today, the fundamental human capacities for problem solving, cooperation, and perseverance remain unchanged. The medieval strategies for survival, careful planning, resource sharing, community bonds, and making the most of available materials, offer lessons that transcend any particular era. They show us that throughout history, humans have found ways to not just survive harsh conditions, but to maintain their humanity and dignity while doing so. These stories from the past remind us of capabilities we all possess, even if we rarely need to use them. What aspects of medieval community cooperation do you think remain relevant today? The connections between past and present might be more meaningful than we realize. Thank you for watching this journey through medieval winter survival. Until next time, take care and stay curious.